40,000 ships of the vast Accord crossed the border at once, and the only thing waiting for them was one old battleship that had been told to hold. Fleet Speaker Quirrell watched the human ship on his forward display and laughed, a dry clicking sound that ran through the command spire of his flagship like wind through reeds. The Accord had sent 40,000 vessels to burn a single human colony called Tamarind, a small farming world of 90,000 people that had refused, politely and firmly, to be absorbed. The Accord absorbed everyone. It was not an empire so much as a flood, a civilization that grew by sheer number, that had never lost a war because it had never fought one it could not drown, and it had decided that Tamarind would be an example, a lesson written in fire so that no other small world would ever again say no. And the humans had answered the flood with one ship. "Confirm the count," Quirrell said, still clicking with amusement. "I want to be certain my sensors are not mocking me." "One vessel, Fleet Speaker," his sensor tender answered. "Human design. Old. Very old. The hull patterns match nothing in our current registry. We found the match 3 layers down, in the archives of wars our grandparents recorded. It is a battleship of a class the humans retired generations ago. The reactor signature is weak. The armor is scarred. By every reading, it is a museum piece that someone forgot to scrap." Quirrell clicked harder. A museum piece. The flood had come with 40,000 ships, enough to blot out a sun, and humanity had answered with an antique. He had expected a fleet. He had braced for some clever human trick, some hidden mass, some swarm pouring out of a moon. He had read the reports of what humans did when cornered, the impossible warships, the category errors, the ships that should not exist. He had prepared for all of it. He had not prepared for contempt, and that, he realized with delight, was exactly what this was. The humans had not even bothered to send a real fleet. They had sent the oldest ship they had, the way a person flicks a single coin to a beggar and walks on. To understand why Quirrell laughed, it is necessary to understand what the vast Accord was, and what it had never once been forced to learn. It had begun, long before Quirrell was hatched, as a single overcrowded world, a species that bred faster than its planet could feed it, and rather than starve or stop, it had simply gone outward, in numbers, the way water goes outward when the cup overflows. It did not conquer the first worlds it reached. It drowned them. It arrived in such quantity that resistance was meaningless, that the defenders looked up at a sky gone solid with hulls and understood, in the way a man understands the tide, that there was no point in fighting the ocean. The worlds folded. The Accord grew. And with each world it grew larger, and with each increase in size it became more certain of the one truth on which its entire civilization was built, which was that there was no problem in the universe that could not be solved by sending more. The Accord did not have generals in the way other species had generals, because generals are for fighting, and the flood did not fight, it simply arrived. It had fleet speakers, and a fleet speaker's job was not to win battles, but to manage the sheer logistics of the flood, to keep 10,000 ranks of ships moving in the same direction, at the same speed without colliding, to feed and fuel and route a force so large that it had its own weather. Quirrell was the finest fleet speaker the Accord had produced in 3 generations. He had moved larger fleets than this across longer distances, and he had never lost a ship to anything but accident, and he had never, in his entire long career, fired a shot in anger, because nothing the Accord had ever met had been worth shooting. The defenders always folded. That was the whole point of being a flood. "Read me its name," Quirrell said. "It calls itself the Old Reliable, Fleet Speaker." The clicking laughter ran the full length of the command spire. The Old Reliable. Not the Vengeance, not the Annihilator, not some grand name to frighten a flood. A plain, tired, almost affectionate name. The name you give a tool you have used for 40 years, and trust with your life, precisely because it has never once let you down. It was, Quirrell thought, the most insulting name humanity could possibly have chosen, because it said, without saying it, that they did not think 40,000 ships were worth a new one. His second tender, a younger officer named Hessel, whose clicking had not yet acquired the dryness of long command, leaned toward the display. "Fleet Speaker," she said carefully. "The archives have more than the hull pattern. I pulled the full entry. This class of ship appears in 7 recorded engagements, all of them generations old. In each of those engagements, the human side was outnumbered. In each of those engagements, The human side won. She paused. I would not have mentioned it, except that the pattern is exact. 7 for 7. The class has a name in the old records that does not translate well. The nearest meaning is, the ship you send when you have decided not to lose. And yet they retired it, Coral said. You said so yourself. A museum piece. If the class were so terrible, they would still be building them. They retired it, yes, Hessel said. The records do not say why. Only that production stopped, and the surviving hulls were scattered to border worlds and home defense, and quiet postings, the way you put an old soldier on a gate. The records also say, and here the younger officer hesitated, because she could feel the laughter in the spire and did not wish to be the one who killed it, that the humans never lost one in combat. Every hull of this class that was ever decommissioned was decommissioned old, at the end of its service, in a dry dock. None was ever destroyed by an enemy. 41 were built. 41 died of old age. That is the entry, Fleet Speaker. I thought you should have it whole. Coral absorbed this, and the laughter did not stop, but it changed, very slightly, the way a sound changes when the one making it has heard something that does not fit. 41 built, 41 died old, none ever killed. It was a strange statistic, and Coral was a creature who lived by statistics, and a part of him filed it away in the careful place where he kept the things that did not fit. But the larger part of him looked at the single weary hull on the display, scarred and slow and alone against 40,000, and could not make the old statistic mean anything in the face of the present arithmetic. Whatever the class had been, generations ago, this was one tired ship, and there were 40,000 of his, and 40,000 to 1 was not a battle. It was a formality. Hail it, Coral said. I wish to hear the human apologize before I drown its world. The channel opened, and a human voice came across it, old and rough and entirely calm, the voice of someone who had done this before, and was not impressed by the number on the display. This is Captain Ed Vance of the defense battleship Old Reliable, the voice said. You're across the Tamarind line. There are 90,000 people on that world who'd like you to turn around. I'd like that too. I'm 61 years old, and I'd rather be fishing. So here's the deal. You turn your 40,000 ships around right now, and we all get to keep being surprised by tomorrow. Or you don't, and you find out why they only sent one. Coral clicked. One old ship, he said, against 40,000. You are outnumbered 40,000 to 1, Captain. Do you understand the number? I understand the number fine, Ed Vance said. Question is whether you understand it. 40,000 to 1. You're thinking that means you win. I'm thinking that means I don't have to aim carefully. Every direction I point this ship, there's something of yours to hit. You brought me the easiest shooting of my whole career. I appreciate that. Makes the fishing wait worth it. The fleet speaker stopped clicking. There was something in the human's voice that did not match the readings, something that did not fit the picture of a museum piece sent out of contempt or desperation. The voice was not afraid. It was not even tense. It was the voice of a man settling into a chair, the voice of someone for whom the difficult part was already behind him, and only the work remained. You are bluffing, Coral said. One ship cannot stop 40,000. It is not a matter of courage, it is a matter of arithmetic. We will pass you in a single minute, and your colony will burn in the second. You keep saying 40,000 to 1 like it's a wall, Ed Vance said. It's not a wall, it's a line. 40,000 ships, all crossing one line, into one system, through one approach, because there's only one approach that doesn't take you through the Tamarind Reefs. You all have to come through the same throat, and I'm standing in the throat. A pause, and Coral heard, faintly, the sound of the old human settling deeper into his chair. You didn't bring 40,000 ships to a battle, Fleet Speaker. You brought 40,000 ships to a doorway, and you stacked them up behind each other, and you handed me a line of targets 10,000 deep that can't spread out and can't turn around. I've been doing this 40 years. I have never in my life been handed a shot this good, so no, I'm not bluffing. I'm just being polite, because my mother raised me to give a man one chance to walk away. Coral looked at the display, and for the first time, he looked at it the way the old human had told him to look at it. He had seen 40,000 ships and read strength. Now he made himself see the approach, the single navigable channel between the Tamarind Reefs, the long throat of dead rock and old wreckage, that any fleet coming to the colony had to pass through, because the reefs on either side would tear apart anything that tried to go around. He had routed his fleet through that throat without a second thought, because routing fleets was what a fleet speaker did, and a throat was just a place you went single file for a while before you spread back out. He had not thought of it as a doorway. He had not thought, because nothing in 11 generations of the flood had ever made him think it, that a doorway only lets through what it is wide enough to admit, and that everything else has to wait its turn behind. "You will spread out beyond the reefs," Quirrell said, half to the human and half to himself. "We will pass the throat and reform in the open, and surround you from every side. The throat is a moment. It is not a battle." "Sure," Ed Vance said. "If you get to the open, you tell me, Fleet Speaker, when 40,000 ships all want to be in the open at the same time, and the only way to the open is through a gap a few hundred ships wide, how long does it take the back of your column to get through? And what's the front of your column doing while it waits?" A soft sound, almost a chuckle. "I'll save you the math. The front of your column is dying, and the back of your column is pushing the middle into the front, and I'm just standing here in the gap, doing the easiest job in the galaxy. Now, last chance. I really would rather be fishing." The forward display showed the flood beginning to compress as it funneled toward the single navigable approach to Tamarind, 40,000 ships narrowing into the throat between the reefs, exactly as the old human had said, a column 10,000 deep, with nowhere to go but forward. And Fleet Speaker Quirrell felt, for the first time in a career of never losing, the smallest cold touch of doubt. He looked at the count again, 40,000. He looked at the single hull. He looked at Hessel, who was watching him, who had given him the old statistic whole, and was now watching to see what he would do with it. And he saw in her steady gaze the thing he could not afford to feel, which was the question of whether the laughter had been wise. "Fleet Speaker," Hessel said quietly, on the private band, "the throat is genuinely narrow. The old human is not wrong about the geometry. I have run it. At our current density, the front of the column engages the battleship, while the rear is still 3 hours from the reefs. We cannot spread until we are through, and we cannot be through quickly. If the battleship is even half as capable as its class records suggest, we will take losses in the throat that we have no doctrine for absorbing, because we have never taken losses we needed doctrine for." She paused. "I am not saying we cannot win. 13 generations of arithmetic say we win. I am saying the win may not be free, and the Accord has never once paid for a win, and a force that has never paid does not know how much it is willing to spend. I would counsel a slower approach. Probe the throat. Send 1,000. Learn the cost before we commit the flood." It was good counsel. It was, Quirrell would understand much later, the best counsel he received that day, and it came from the youngest officer in the spire, the one who still read the archives whole. And Quirrell, who was the finest fleet speaker in 3 generations, who had never lost a ship to anything but accident, who had laughed at a museum piece, made the decision that floods make, the only decision a flood knows how to make. "We do not probe," he said. "We do not learn the cost. The cost is irrelevant. We are the vast Accord. We are 40,000. We arrive, and the world folds, as every world has folded. To probe is to admit that one old ship is worth caution, and one old ship is not worth caution. Send the whole column. Send it now. I will not give a museum piece the dignity of a careful approach." Hessel made one last attempt, because she was young enough to still believe a true thing said clearly could change a course already set. "Fleet Speaker," she said, low and urgent, "consider only this, and I will be silent after. We have never lost. That is our whole strength, and it is also our whole blindness. Because a thing that has never lost has never learned what losing teaches, and the first time it loses badly, because it has no practice at it. We are about to do a thing we have never done, against a kind of enemy we have never met, in a place that takes our greatest advantage and turns it inside out. Every instinct you have was built by victories that this situation does not resemble. I am asking you to distrust your instincts for 1 hour, because for the first time in 11 generations they may be wrong. Probe, learn, then commit, if commitment is still wise. That is all. I am silent now." It was, Quirrell would think much later, in the long quiet of the journey home, the wisest thing he ever heard said aboard an Accord ship, and he had heard it before the first shot was fired, and he had not listened. because the not listening was the very thing Hessel had warned him of. The instincts built by victory had spoken louder than the young voice built by reading, and Quirrell had trusted the louder one, as floods always do. "Last chance, Fleet Speaker," Ed Vance said over the open channel, as though he had heard the decision before Quirrell had finished making it. "Turn around. I really would rather be fishing." Quirrell gave the order to advance, because 40,000 to 1 was a number that could not lose, and the old battleship in the throat of the reefs lit its weary engines, and Captain Ed Vance, 61 years old and tired and entirely calm, took the first shot of a battle that the vast Accord would spend the rest of its history trying to forget. The first shot did not look like much, and that was the second thing that began to unsettle Fleet Speaker Quirrell. It was a single round, fired from the forward batteries of the old Reliable, down the long throat of the reefs, and it struck the leading ship of the Accord column, and the leading ship of the Accord column came apart. Not breached, not crippled. It came apart the way a dropped plate comes apart, all at once, into pieces, and the pieces kept moving forward at the speed the ship had been traveling, and they struck the ship behind, which was already moving forward at the same speed, with nowhere to turn, and that ship came apart too, and its pieces struck the third, and Quirrell watched, with the dawning horror of a mathematician who has spotted an error in the foundation of his proof, the leading edge of his 40,000 ship column begin to fold in on itself like a concertina. "He is using our own formation against us," the sensor tender said, and the click in her voice had lost all its amusement. "The column cannot spread. The reefs are too tight. Each ship that is destroyed becomes debris, and the debris travels at attack velocity into the ships behind, which cannot stop in time, and cannot turn aside. Fleet Speaker, the column is destroying itself." Quirrell understood, in that moment, the full shape of the trap he had driven his fleet into, and he understood that the old human had not built the trap at all. The reefs had always been there. The single approach had always been there. The only thing Ed Vance had done was decline to fight the flood in open space, where 40,000 ships could have spread into a sphere and swallowed one battleship from every side at once. He had stepped back into the throat, where the flood could only come at him a few hundred ships at a time, and where the flood's own enormous momentum, its own unstoppable forward press of 10,000 ranks, became the very thing that ground it to pieces against the wreckage of its own vanguard. "Halt the column," Quirrell ordered. "Halt the advance." "We cannot, Fleet Speaker," the sensor tender said. "The ships at the rear are still accelerating into the throat. They do not yet know what is happening at the front. By the time the order reaches them, they will already have pushed the middle ranks into the debris. We are 40,000 ships deep. The front cannot stop, because the back is still pushing. The back cannot stop because it is still receiving the order to advance. We have made ourselves into a single thing, Fleet Speaker, and the single thing is too large to halt." This was the curse of the flood, and Quirrell had never once seen it as a curse until this exact moment. The vast Accord won by being too large to stop. It poured itself at an enemy in numbers that could not be halted, could not be turned, could not be reasoned with, a tide that simply kept coming until the enemy drowned. It had never occurred to the Accord, in all its history of victory, that a tide that cannot be stopped by the enemy also cannot be stopped by itself, and that an old battleship standing in the right doorway could turn the flood's own unstoppable nature into the instrument of its destruction. Ed Vance did not have to defeat 40,000 ships. He only had to kill the front rank faster than the rear rank could stop pushing, and the flood would feed itself into his guns, ship after ship after ship, driven forward by the irresistible weight of its own enormous self. "How many have we lost?" Quirrell said. The sensor tender was quiet for a moment, counting. 312, Fleet Speaker, she said, in 90 seconds. There was a thing happening in the spire that Quirrell was too occupied to name, but that Hessel saw clearly, watching the officers around her, the way she watched everything. The flood had no concept of fear, not because its people were brave, but because they had never been in a position to need the concept. Fear is the response of a thing that can be hurt to the prospect of being hurt, and the vast Accord, for 11 generations, had not been able to be hurt. It had been the hurting. And now, in the space of 90 seconds, the officers of the flagship were discovering fear the way a person born without pain discovers a burn, all at once, with no callous and no language for it, and they were reacting badly. because there is no graceful way to feel a thing for the first time when the thing is terror and the stakes are everything. Some of them had gone rigid at their stations. Some were clicking the rapid arrhythmic click that meant a mind running faster than it could think. One, a routing officer 2 ranks below Hessel, had simply stopped, hands frozen over a board that needed his hands, staring at the count as though staring could change it. Hessel reached over without a word and took up his board herself and worked it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would help, and because she understood that she was watching not just the death of ships, but the death of a certainty so old and so total that the species had built its entire self upon it, and that the people around her were not cowards but children. Suddenly, all of them, in a dark they had never imagined could exist. 312 ships in 90 seconds, and the old reliable had not moved from the throat, had not taken a hit that mattered, had simply stood there and fired and let the flood do the rest. Quarrel ran the arithmetic he had been so confident in an hour ago, the clean arithmetic of 40,000 to 1, and found that it had inverted while he was not looking. The number was no longer his advantage. The number was the old human's ammunition. The more ships Quarrel sent into the throat, the more targets Ed Vance had, and the more debris filled the reefs, and the worse the folding became. The flood's size, which had never once been anything but strength, had become, in the space of an old man's fishing complaint, the single greatest liability in the history of the vast accord. There was a reason the old reliable had been posted to the Tamarind line, and it was not, as the accord assumed, that humanity had nothing better to send. The ship had been posted there because Ed Vance had asked for the posting, and Ed Vance had asked for the posting because of the reefs. He had read the charts of every quiet border the fleet had offered an aging captain in his last years of service, and most of them were open space, where an old ship was only an old ship, and one of them was Tamarind, where the only approach to the colony ran through a throat of dead rock a few hundred ships wide. An ordinary captain saw a difficult navigation hazard and asked for somewhere easier. Ed Vance saw a doorway, to a man who had spent 40 years learning that the place you stand matters more than the strength you bring, was the most valuable thing a tired ship could be given. He had taken the Tamarind posting the way a chess player takes a corner square, quietly, years ahead of the game, and he had spent those years learning the reefs the way other men learn a face, every current and shoal and blind angle of them, so that when the day came, if it ever came, he would not be fighting 40,000 ships. He would be fighting geometry, and the geometry would be his. On the bridge of the old reliable, the old man worked the way he had worked for 40 years, which is to say without hurry, without drama, and almost without thought, because the thinking had all been done long before, in the quiet years between wars, when there was nothing to do but learn the ship and the reefs and the slow arithmetic of doorways. Ed Vance did not have a large crew. The old reliable, in her last posting, ran on a skeleton complement. 11 hands, where once she had carried 400, because a museum piece on a quiet border does not rate 400 lives, and Ed Vance had not argued the point when the cuts came, because 11 good hands, who knew the ship, were worth more to him than 400 who did not. They were with him now, all 11, at the stations that mattered, and they were as calm as he was, because calm runs downhill from the captain, and their captain had never in their memory been anything else. "Gun heat," Ed Vance said. "Climbing, Captain," said the woman at the weapons board, a chief named Orla Tan, who had served the old reliable 18 years, and knew her guns the way a musician knows an instrument left to her by the dead. "We can run this rate another 40 minutes before I have to start nursing it. After that we manage." "We won't need 40 minutes," Ed Vance said, "but manage like we will. I don't want them seeing a steady rate. I want them seeing a rate that flickers, a rate that looks like it's tiring. You understand me, Orla?" "I understand you, Captain," Orla Tan said, and the smallest smile crossed her face, because she did understand him, had understood him since the first shot, and there was a particular pleasure in helping an old man tell a lie with a gun. "I'll make her look as old as they think she is." "Good," Ed Vance said. "Let them have their hope. Hope's expensive. Make them pay full price." He leaned back in the chair that had held him through 3 wars and looked at the display, where the front of the flood was eating itself against the wall of its own dead, and for a moment, something crossed his weathered face that was not calm at all. something older and heavier, the look of a man counting a cost he had counted many times before and had never once gotten used to. 40,000 of them, he said, quietly, to no one. Somebody sent 40,000 crews out here to burn a place full of farmers. Whoever gave that order never had to look at it. He shook his head once, slowly. Well, they're looking at it now. The youngest hand on the bridge, a signals rating named Teo Marsh, who had been aboard the Old Reliable barely a year, found his voice for the first time since the firing started. Captain, he said, and the word came out rougher than he meant it. Are we going to win this? It was not a question one asked an officer, and he knew it as he said it, but the count on the display had passed 3,000 of theirs, and not one of ours, and the size of that made a young man need to hear an old one say a plain thing plainly. Ed Vance did not answer right away. He looked at the boy, who was about the age his granddaughter had been when she went to the colonies. About the age, he thought, that everyone fighting on both sides of this had been once, and he gave him the truth, because the truth was the only thing worth giving a frightened person. Son, he said, winning's not the right word for what we're doing. We're not going to beat them. There's too many of them to beat. That's just arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't lie. What we're going to do is hold the door. That's all. We hold the door long enough, and they figure out the door's not worth it, and they go home, and the people on Tamarin get to plant next season. That's the whole job, not winning, holding. You can hold a door a lot longer than you can win a war. He turned back to the display. Now stop worrying about the score, and tend your board. The people down there need their signals man sharp, and so do I. Aye, Captain, Teo Marsh said, and the steadiness came back into him, because steadiness, like calm, runs downhill, and there was a great deal of it at the top of the Old Reliable. Open the channel again, Quirrell said, in the command spire, the words coming out of him before he had decided to say them. It opened, and the old human's voice came back, no different than before, calm and tired and steady, as though nothing had happened, as though he were not in the process of grinding a civilization's war fleet to dust. Changed your mind about the fishing? Ed Vance said. You will run out of ammunition, Quirrell said. It was not quite a question. It was the last certainty he had, and he reached for it, the way a falling thing reaches for any handhold. One ship cannot carry enough rounds to destroy 40,000 vessels. You will fire until your magazines are empty, and then the flood will pass you, and Tamarind will burn, and all of this will have been for nothing. That's a good thought, Ed Vance said. You're right that I can't carry 40,000 rounds. Old Reliable's a battleship, not a magazine ship. But here's the thing you're still not seeing, Fleet Speaker, and I'll tell you because I'm a generous man. I don't need 40,000 rounds. I need enough rounds to kill your front rank faster than your back rank can stop pushing. After that, your fleet does my job for me. Every ship I drop becomes a wall. The wall stops the ones behind. The ones behind become more wall. I'm not shooting 40,000 ships. I'm building a dam, one ship at a time, and your own flood is filling it in behind me. I could stop firing right now, and you'd still lose 10,000 ships to the pileup before the rear ranks even understood they needed to stop. So no, I won't run out. I'll have ammunition left over. I usually do. Quirrell closed the channel, because he could not bear to hear any more of that calm, that terrible patient calm, the calm of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how it ended. He turned to Hessel, the young officer who had read the archives whole, and found her already looking at him, and there was no reproach in her face, which was somehow worse than reproach. You counseled a probe, he said. I did not take the counsel. Say it. Say it now, while it can still matter. It cannot still matter, Fleet Speaker, Hessel said. The column is committed. There is nothing to say about the past that the present is not already saying louder. She looked at the display, at the count climbing, at the wall of dead growing in the throat. But there is something to say about the future, if you will hear it. We are losing ships at a rate the flood has never absorbed. There is a number, somewhere ahead of us, at which the loss stops being a cost and becomes a wound. I do not know the number. No one in the Accord knows the number, because we have never approached it. But it exists, Fleet Speaker, and we are moving toward it very fast, and when we reach it, the question will not be whether we can take Tamarind. The question will be whether there is enough of the Accord left to matter that we took it. She paused. I counsel withdrawal, now. before the number, while the loss is still a cost. For 9 more minutes, the flood fed itself into the throat of the reefs, and the old reliable stood in the doorway and fired, and the wall of wreckage grew, and Quirrell watched the most powerful war fleet in the known galaxy grind itself to fragments against the single thing it had brought too many ships to stop. He did not give the order to withdraw, because he could not. Because a fleet speaker who withdrew the flood from a museum piece would not be a fleet speaker for long, and because somewhere in him, the old certainty still insisted that the next rank, or the rank after that, would be the one that broke through. By the end of those 9 minutes, the count had passed 4,000, and the old reliable had taken exactly 1 hit of consequence, a glancing strike on its forward armor that Ed Vance reported, over the channel he reopened just to say it, had not even spilled his coffee. But the old reliable was old, and even the best old thing has limits, and somewhere in the 10th minute, Fleet Speaker Quirrell found the limit, and the finding gave him the first real hope he had felt since the leading ship came apart. The old battleship's rate of fire had begun, very slightly, to slow. It was not the ammunition. The human had been right about the ammunition, and the wall of wreckage in the throat was doing more killing now than the guns were. It was the guns themselves. The old reliable was a museum piece, and museum pieces, however lovingly maintained, were old, and old guns ran hot, and hot guns had to rest or they cracked. Quirrell saw it in the firing pattern, the tiny lengthening of the gaps between salvos, the old ship managing its heat the way an old runner manages his breath, and he understood that the battle had become, after all, a matter of arithmetic, just not the arithmetic he had started with. The question was no longer whether 40,000 could beat 1. The question was whether the old ship's guns could outlast the old ship's enemies, and that was a question with 2 sides. And for the first time, Quirrell could see a path, narrow and bloody and enormously expensive, to the far side of the throat. "Push everything," Quirrell ordered. "All reserves. Do not let the guns rest. The ship is overheating. If we keep the pressure constant, the guns will fail before our numbers do. Feed the throat. Feed it until the guns crack." It was a monstrous order, and Quirrell gave it, knowing exactly what it cost. He was ordering his own fleet to die faster, to throw itself into the throat in greater numbers than the wreckage could even accommodate, to pile wreck on wreck and ship on ship, all to deny one old battleship the few seconds of rest its overheating guns needed. He was spending thousands of lives to buy heat, but the flood had always spent lives the way other powers spent fuel, and Quirrell was a fleet speaker of the vast accord, and he had not risen to command 40,000 ships by flinching from the arithmetic of the flood. One old ship, a finite number of guns, a finite tolerance for heat. If he pushed hard enough, fast enough, without mercy, the guns would fail, and when the guns failed, the flood would pour through, and Tamarind would burn after all, and the lesson would be written, and it would cost him perhaps 15,000 ships, and 15,000 ships was a price the Accord could pay, and the human could not. Hessel did not counsel against it this time. She had counseled twice, and twice been overruled, and she understood now that the fleet speaker was no longer making decisions out of doctrine, or even out of pride, but out of the deeper thing beneath both, the thing that had made the flood a flood in the first place, which was the simple inability to stop. So she said nothing, and she watched the reserves pour into the throat, and she made a quiet private record of the count and the time, because she had begun to suspect, somewhere in the cold, clear part of her mind that read archives whole, that someone was going to need to carry this day home and explain it, and that the explaining would matter more than the battle, and that she might be the one who had watched closely enough to do it. The reserves poured into the throat, and the old reliable's guns ran hotter, and the gaps between the salvos lengthened, and Fleet Speaker Quirrell leaned forward in the command spire and watched, for the first time in the battle, something that might have been the beginning of his victory. What Quirrell did not know, what he could not have known, was that Captain Ed Vance had been managing the heat in his guns for 40 years, and that an old man who has done a thing for 40 years knows the exact difference between a gun that is running hot and a gun that is about to fail, and that Ed Vance had been letting the gaps lengthen on purpose, a little at a time, because he had run the same arithmetic Quirrell had run, and he had seen the same narrow, bloody path, and he had decided, in the calm, tired way he decided everything, to let the fleet speaker believe he could walk it. "They're pushing harder," Orlatan said from the weapons board, reading the whole reserve coming up the throat. They bought your tired guns, Captain. They're spending everything to crack them. They would, Advance said. It's the only move they've got left that fits who they are. A flood doesn't know how to do anything but pour. We showed them the slow pour wasn't working, so now they're going to try the fast pour. And the fast pour is going to be worse for them than the slow one was, because the fast pour commits everything at once, and a thing that commits everything at once can't take any of it back. He watched the display, where the throat was filling with more ships than it could hold, where the flood was pressing its full remaining weight against the wall of its own dead in a desperate effort to overwhelm a few overheating guns. How's our charge? Orlatan's smile came back, slow and grim. Banked deep, Captain. Every salvo I've held back for the last 10 minutes is sitting in the capacitors. We've got more saved than we've fired. They think the gaps are the guns tiring. The gaps are the guns loading. That's the joke, Advance said softly. That's the whole joke. They've spent 40 years learning that more is always the answer, and they never once met the one situation where holding back is. They can't read patience, Orla. It's not in them. They look at a slow rate and they see weakness. Because to a flood, slow is always weakness. They don't have a word for a man who's slow on purpose. He set down the cup that had not, in fact, ever spilled, and his voice changed, just slightly, the calm hardening into something with an edge under it. All right, they've committed. Everything they had left is in the throat now, stacked up behind their own wreckage with nowhere to go. Let's stop being old. The thing about a flood, Advance knew, is that it commits. A tide that has decided to drown you does not hold anything back, and the moment Quarrel ordered all reserves into the throat, the moment the flood committed its full remaining weight to the single push that would crack the human guns, it lost the one thing it had left, which was the ability to stop. Advance had not been failing. He had been fishing, the way he had told them from the start, casting a long, slow line and waiting for the flood to take the hook all the way down. And now, with 30-some thousand ships of the vast accord pouring at full commitment into a throat already half-choked with the wreckage of their own vanguard, the old man set down his coffee and stopped managing his heat and showed Fleet Speaker Quarrel what the old Reliable could actually do when its captain stopped being polite. The old battleship's guns, which had been firing in measured single salvos, all opened at once. Quarrel had thought the old Reliable was an old ship nursing tired weapons to the edge of failure. He had been wrong about that, the way he had been wrong about everything since the leading ship came apart. The lengthening gaps had not been the guns failing, they had been the guns charging, banking power salvo by salvo across 10 long minutes, while the old man let the flood believe it was winning a race of heat, and now the full charge released down the throat of the reefs in a single sustained barrage that did not destroy the front rank of the committed push. It destroyed the front 50 ranks, all at once, a wall of fire that walked down the throat and turned thousands of ships into a single expanding cloud of wreckage that slammed back into the thousands more pressing forward behind them, and the concertina that had been folding the flood for 10 minutes now folded it in a single catastrophic collapse, rank driving into rank, the full committed weight of the vast accord crushing itself against the wall of its own dead. "Cease the advance," Quarrel screamed, all the click gone from his voice, only the raw sound left. "Cease, cease, reverse engines, all ships reverse." "They can't hear you in time," Advance said, over the channel, almost gently. "I told you that an hour ago. You're too big to stop. That was always the whole problem with being a flood. The thing that makes you unstoppable is the thing that means you can't stop yourselves. I've been waiting 40 years for a fleet big enough to do this to itself. You're the biggest one yet. Thank you for that. It's the easiest fishing I've ever had." The collapse ran the full length of the throat, the full 10,000 rank depth of the committed flood, and Fleet Speaker Quarrel watched the count on his display spin past 10,000, past 15, past 20, faster than the system could update it, the vast accord destroying itself in a chain that no order could halt, because the order could not outrun the wreckage, and the old battleship stood in the doorway, scarred and weary, and entirely unmoved, and did not even need to keep firing, because the flood, at last, was drowning in itself. On the bridge of the old Reliable, no one cheered. Advance had served with men who cheered, in the early wars, Young men who had not yet learned what the count on the display actually was, and he had never once joined them, because he had learned early the thing that took most soldiers a lifetime to learn, and most never learned at all, which was that the number going up on your enemy's side of the board was not a score. It was a column of crews. Each tick was a ship, and each ship was a complement, and somewhere behind each complement was a world that had bred them and named them, and would, in time, miss them, and the fact that they had come to burn his farmers did not make them less real on the way to becoming wreckage. He did the arithmetic he always did, the arithmetic no one had ordered him to do, and no metal would ever recognize, which was the arithmetic of cost against cost, the lives going up in the throat against the 90,000 on the green world below, and he found, as he always found, that the 90,000 came first, and that finding it did not make the rest of it weigh any less. "That'll do it," he said quietly, watching the chain run its full length. "That's the back broken. They'll pull what's left out of the throat now, and once they're out, they'll start to think, and once they start to think, it's over, because the only thing keeping them coming was not thinking." He looked at the count, at the impossible scale of the dead. 20,000 crews, he said, and there was no triumph in it at all, only the old heaviness. I'd have given anything for them to turn around at the line. I meant it when I said it, every word of it. I really would rather have been fishing. "I know, Captain," Orla Tan said, because she did know, had known for 18 years. "But they didn't turn around. That part was theirs, not yours." "That part was theirs," Ed Vance agreed. "I just hope the one who lives to carry it home is paying attention. That's the only way it ever means anything. Somebody's got to learn it, or it's just a graveyard." It was in the middle of that collapse, with the count spinning and the spire full of the raw, uncorded sound of officers who had never in their lives heard the flood scream, that young Hessel did the bravest thing done aboard any Accord ship that day, which was to keep her head. She stopped watching the count, because the count was only a number and the number was already lost, and she watched instead the human ship, the way an archivist watches the thing that matters, rather than the thing that is loud. And so she was the first aboard the flagship to notice that the old Reliable, in the heart of its victory, was not entirely whole. There was a flaw in its forward signature, a faint, irregular flicker in the reactor band, the kind of thing a sensor tender would miss in the noise of 40,000 ships dying, but an archivist watching one ship would catch. She said nothing of it, not yet, because she did not yet understand what it meant. But she logged it, with the time, the way she logged everything, and the log would matter later, in a way she could not have guessed, on a day years away, when the vast Accord finally learned the name of the man it had not been able to kill, and learned, too, what killing him had cost. Quarrel pulled the surviving ranks back from the throat, what was left of them, and the pulling back was the hardest thing he had ever done, because the vast Accord did not pull back, had never pulled back, did not have, in all its vast and ancient doctrine, a single procedure for retreat. They had simply never needed one. You do not teach a flood to recede. The flood goes forward, always forward, drowning what it touches, and if a thing cannot be drowned, the flood has no answer, because it was never built to have one. Quarrel improvised the retreat out of nothing, out of raw panic and broken doctrine, and it cost him thousands more ships, vessels colliding in the confusion, ranks driving into the ranks ahead of them as the order to reverse met the lingering momentum of the order to advance. By the time the survivors had clawed their way back out of the throat and into the open space beyond the reefs, the count had passed 26,000 lost, and the battle had lasted, from the first shot to the broken retreat, just under 18 minutes. 26,000 ships in 18 minutes, against one. Quarrel sat in the command spire of his flagship and looked at the number and could not make it mean anything. The vast Accord had fought 1,000 wars and lost a few hundred ships across all of them combined. It had absorbed 1,000 worlds and never once paid more than a token for any of them, because the flood did not pay. The flood simply arrived, in numbers too great to resist, and the worlds folded, and the Accord grew. There was no precedent in 11 generations of Accord history for the loss of 26,000 ships in a single engagement. There was barely a precedent for the loss of 26, and it had been done by one old battleship with a tired captain who would rather have been fishing, standing in a doorway, declining to do anything except let the flood drown in its own enormous weight. Far below the throat, on the green and ordinary surface of Tamarind, 90,000 people had spent those 18 minutes doing the only thing they could do, which was wait and listen. Tamarind was not a martial world. It grew grain and tended orchards and shipped its harvest to colonies that could not feed themselves, and it had no army, no fleet, no weapons heavier than the tools a farmer keeps against the things that prey on stock. When the Accord's demand had come, the demand to fold or burn, the colony's small council had argued through a long night, and in the end, they had voted, 90,000 of them through their representatives, to say no. Not out of courage exactly, but out of something simpler and harder to break. The plain refusal of people who have built a life with their hands, to be told that the life does not count. They had said no, and they had sent the no to Earth along with a request they did not expect to be answered, and Earth had answered with one ship, and the people of Tamarind had looked up at the single old hull settling into the throat of the reefs, and understood that the no had cost them everything, and that the everything was already spent, and that all they could do now was wait and see what the no had bought. In the colony's communications hall, a woman named Brisa Okun stood at the listening board and did not move for 18 minutes. She was the colony's senior signals officer, which on a farming world meant she handled the weather relays and the harvest schedules and the long-distance calls home, and she had never once in her life listened to a battle. She listened to this one. She heard the old captain's voice come across the band, calm and tired, and offering the flood one chance to leave, and she heard the fleet speaker laugh, and she heard the first shot, and then she heard, over the long minutes, the sound of a number dying, the flat reports of the old reliable sensors counting the wreckage as it grew, and she understood, slowly, the way you understand a sunrise, that the old man in the throat was not losing. The hall around her filled, quietly, person by person, until half the colony's leadership stood at her back in silence, listening to an old human they would never meet hold the door against the end of their world. "He's talking to them like he knows them," said the colony's eldest counselor, a man named Garen Pell who had voted for the no and had not slept since. "Like he's done this before. Listen to him. He's not even angry." "He's been doing it 40 years, Brisa Okun said. "He said so, 40 years. She did not take her eyes from the board. "I think this is what 40 years sounds like." Garen Pell lowered himself onto a bench, because his legs would no longer hold him through the listening, and he put his old farmer's hands flat on his knees and stared at nothing. "I voted for the no," he said, to the room, to himself, to the men and women of his own age, who had voted the same way in that long night, and had not been sure, in the days since, whether they had voted for survival or for the end of everything. I keep thinking about that. I voted for the no, and I told myself it was principle, and maybe it was, but principle's a cheap thing to spend when it's other people who pay. I thought we'd pay, all of us. I made my peace with paying. He looked up at the board, at the impossible count, at the sound of the old voice that would not stop being kind. And now there's a man up there paying it instead. And I don't even know his face. 90,000 of us, and he doesn't know a single one of our names, and he's holding the door anyway. "He knows what we are," said a younger counselor, a woman named Ife Soto who ran the eastern orchards. "That's enough for some people. He knows we're farmers who said no. I don't think a man like that needs to know your name to decide you're worth it." She was quiet a moment, listening. "I think people like that are mostly the reason the rest of us get to be small and safe and never have to find out what we'd do in his chair." Brisa Okun said nothing, because the board had begun to report the great collapse, and the hall went silent again, all of them, old and young, the ones who had voted yes and the ones who had voted no, joined for these last minutes into the single quiet act of witnessing the price of the word they had chosen. When the great collapse came, the colony felt it before the board reported it, a flicker in the sky over the reefs, a brightening that was not dawn, and the listening hall held its breath, and Brisa Okun watched the count on the relay spin past numbers that meant nothing to a farming world, 10,000, 15, 20, and she began, without deciding to cry, not from fear, because the fear had passed, but from the sheer impossible size of what the no had bought, and from the sound of the old man's voice, which through all of it had never once risen, had never once stopped being kind. Back in the command spire, Fleet Speaker Coral had gathered the broken remnant of the flood in the open space beyond the reefs, and was facing the question he did not know how to answer. Fleet Speaker, the sensor tender said, and her voice had gone very small. The survivors are asking for orders. 13,000 vessels remain. We still outnumber the human ship 13,000 to 1. By the original arithmetic, we have more than enough to take the colony. What are your orders? It was true. 13,000 to 1 was still an impossible advantage by any sane measure. The flood, even halved and halved again, still vastly outnumbered the single old ship in the throat. And the old arithmetic, the clean, confident arithmetic Coral had laughed with an hour ago, said that 13,000 could not lose to 1. But Coral had watched the old arithmetic invert once already, watched 40,000 to 1 become a strength for the human and a curse for the flood, and he understood now what the original arithmetic had never accounted for. The reefs were still there. The throat was still there. There was still only one approach to Tamarind, and it was still choked, now far worse than before, with the wreckage of 26,000 ships. And the old battleship still stood in the doorway, its guns recharged, its captain calm, and it did not care in the slightest whether the flood that came at it numbered 40,000 or 13,000 or 13, because the throat only admitted a few hundred at a time, and a few hundred at a time was exactly the rate at which the old reliable had been killing them all along. Open the channel, Coral said, for the third time. This is getting to be a habit, Fleet Speaker, Ed Vance said. I'm starting to think you like me. How? Coral said. It was not a strategic question. It was the question of a mind that has had its foundation pulled out from under it and is reaching, desperately, for any handhold of understanding. How does one ship do this? I have 13,000 vessels. By every law of war I have ever known, 13,000 vessels cannot be stopped by one. Tell me how. I am asking honestly. I have to understand it, or I cannot carry it home. There was a pause on the channel, and when Ed Vance spoke again, the calm was still there, but something else had come into it, something almost like sympathy, the weariness of an old soldier explaining to a young one a lesson that can only ever be learned too late. You want the truth? Ed Vance said. The truth is, you beat yourself. I barely fired after the first 10 minutes. The reefs did most of it, and your own momentum did the rest. All I did was stand in the one place where your numbers couldn't help you, and your size couldn't stop. You spent your whole history learning that more is always better. Nobody ever taught you the one place where more is worse, because nobody ever survived long enough to teach you. That place is a doorway. In a doorway, it doesn't matter if you're 40,000 or 4 million. The doorway only lets a few through at a time, and a few at a time is something one good ship can handle all day. You didn't lose because I was strong, Fleet Speaker. You lost because you were too big to fit through the door you had to come through. And you came anyway, because being too big to stop is the only thing you know how to be. Coral absorbed this in silence. It was, he understood, the most important thing anyone had ever told the vast Accord, and it had been told to him by the thing that was in the process of destroying his fleet, freely, almost kindly, the way you tell a hard truth to someone you have already beaten and no longer need to fear. Then I will not send the rest through the throat, Coral said slowly, finding, in the wreckage of his certainty, the first genuinely new thought he had ever had. There is no second approach. The reefs admit no other path. If I send 13,000 ships through the throat, I will lose them the way I lost the others, a few hundred at a time, fed into your guns and your wall, until either your guns fail or my fleet is gone, and I no longer believe your guns will fail. So I will not send them. The colony will live. I will withdraw. That's the smartest thing anybody in your whole fleet has said today, Ed Vance said. Take the win, Fleet Speaker. Going home with 13,000 ships is a better day than it was looking like an hour ago. But Fleet Speaker Coral did not withdraw, not yet, because he was a creature of the vast Accord, and the vast Accord did not withdraw. And even now, even broken, even having just spoken the wisest words of his life, the old habit reached up through him and found one last move. The move the flood always made when the simple forward press had failed. The move it had never needed before because the simple forward press had never failed before. There is another way, Coral said, and he said it to the sensor tender, not to the human, the channel forgotten. We cannot pass the throat as a fleet. But we do not need to pass it as a fleet. We need only to pass one ship, a single vessel, loaded with everything we have, driven at the throat at maximum velocity. The human cannot stop a thing moving fast enough. Even his guns have a tracking limit. One ship, through the gap, past the battleship, to the colony. We burn Tamarind with one ship, and the lesson is still written, and the loss of the fleet becomes the price of the lesson, instead of a defeat. The censor tender was silent for a long moment. "Fleet speaker," she said, "that ship would be a suicide run. Whoever flies it does not come back. And even if it passes the battleship, even if it reaches Tamarind, we will have spent 26,000 ships and a volunteer to burn one farming world that ask only to be left alone. Is the lesson worth that? Is any lesson worth that?" It was Hessel who answered, before Quarrel could, and she answered not the censor tender, but the fleet speaker, and she answered the way an archivist answers, with the long view. "Fleet speaker," she said, "I have watched this whole battle. I have logged it, and I will tell you what the log says, because someone has to. The log says, we lost the moment we treated a no as an insult instead of a question. We came to write a lesson, and the lesson got written, but it was not the one we meant to write. If you send the one ship now, you will not unwrite the lesson. You will only add a line to it, and the line will say that the vast accord, having lost 26,000 ships to its own size, chose to murder 90,000 farmers out of spite, because it could not bear to go home having learned something. That is the line you will write. I ask you not to write it, not for the farmers, though for them too, for us, for what we might still become if we leave this place having lost a battle, instead of having proven we were monsters." And Fleet Speaker Quarrel, sitting in the command spire of a flagship that led the broken remnant of the greatest fleet the galaxy had ever seen, found that he did not have an answer to Hessel, and the not having of the answer was, he understood dimly, the real beginning of the end of the vast accord. Because a flood that has begun to question whether the drowning is worth it is a flood that has already started, somewhere deep in itself, to recede. The suicide ship launched anyway, because Quarrel gave the order before his doubt could finish forming. The old habit, faster than the new thought, and the move was the last mistake the vast accord made at Tamarind. It was a good plan, in the cold way of the flood. A single fast attack vessel, stripped of everything but engines and a planet-burning payload, driven at the throat, at a velocity that pushed the limits of what the reefs could survive, threading the gap on a course calculated to slip past the old Reliable, in the half-second window, when the battleship's guns would be tracking elsewhere. It relied on speed, and on timing, and on the assumption that even a good old ship has a tracking limit, a maximum speed past which its guns cannot swing. It was the kind of plan that worked, sometimes, against ordinary defenders. Quarrel had used versions of it before, in the early wars, before the flood had grown so large that it never needed cleverness. Ed Vance had been waiting for it for 18 minutes. "There it is," the old captain said, to the quiet bridge of the old Reliable, to the 11 hands who had held with him, to the 40 years of war that had taught him exactly this. "The fast one. They always send the fast one, when the slow way stops working. I've buried a lot of fast ones." He looked at Orlatan. "You see it?" "I see it, Captain," Orlatan said. "Point defense is cold and ready. It hasn't fired all day. They don't even know we have it." Her hands were steady on the board. "Just say when." "Not yet," Ed Vance said. "Let it commit. Same as the fleet. Let it get all the way in, where it can't change its mind. A fast ship's just a flood with one drop. It can't stop either." He watched the small, fierce light of the suicide vessel come slicing up the throat, threading the gap between the reefs and the wall of the dead, and he waited, with the patience that the flood had never been able to read, until the thing was past the point of any return. "Now," he said quietly, "close the door." The suicide vessel came through the throat at a velocity that should have been impossible, slicing the gap between the reefs and the wall of wreckage on a knife-edge course, and it timed its run perfectly, threading the gap in the exact instant the old Reliable's main batteries were tracking the broken edge of the retreating flood. By every calculation Quarrel had run, the fast ship should have slipped past in the half-second window before the old battleship's guns could swing back. But Ed Vance had not been tracking the retreating flood with his main batteries, because he expected to fire on it. He had been tracking it because it was the obvious thing to track, the thing a desperate enemy would assume he was watching. And an old man who has buried a lot of fast ones does not point his main batteries at the thing he is actually waiting for. He points his smallest, fastest, most agile point defense guns at the gap, the close-in weapons built not for capital ships, but for exactly this, for the small, fast thing that thinks it can thread a needle, and he keeps them quiet, and cold, and ready, and he waits. The suicide ship threaded the gap, and the old Reliable's point defense guns, which had not fired once in the entire battle, which Quarrel's sensors had not even registered as armed, woke up and filled the gap with a curtain of close-range fire so dense that the fast ship did not so much get hit as run into a wall of metal, disintegrating 1,000 kilometers short of the battleship, its planet-burning payload going up in a flash that lit the throat of the reefs like a second small sun and harmed nothing but the wreckage already drifting there. 40 years, Ed Vance said, settling back into his chair. 40 years, and they still send the fast one. Some lessons just don't take. In the command spire of his flagship, Fleet Speaker Quarrel watched the flash of the suicide ship's death and felt the last of the old certainty go out of him, the way the last warmth goes out of a body, slowly, and then all at once. He had thrown everything the Flood had at one old battleship, the simple forward press, the committed full-weight push, the cold arithmetic of overheating guns, the desperate single fast ship. Every move the vast Accord had ever made in its long history of victory, he had made, and every one of them had broken against the same scarred old hull standing in the same doorway, and the old man inside it had not even raised his voice. 13,000 vessels remain, the sensor tender said quietly. What are your orders, Fleet Speaker? And Quarrel, at last, gave the order the vast Accord had no procedure for. The order it had never once needed in 11 generations. The order that would end, not just the battle, but the long age of the Flood. We withdraw, he said. All ships. We leave Tamarind. We go home. The channel was still open, and Ed Vance heard it, and the old captain was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing that Quarrel would carry home, and repeat to the councils of the vast Accord for the rest of his life. That's the right call, Fleet Speaker, Ed Vance said. I'll tell you something, since you're leaving, and we'll probably never talk again. I didn't beat you. I want you to understand that, because it matters. One ship can't beat 40,000. That's not how it works. What happened today is your fleet beat itself, and I just stood in the place where I could watch it happen. You want to never lose like this again? Don't get smaller. Get wiser. Learn where the doorways are. Learn that there's a place where all your numbers turn into a weight you can't carry. And the next time a little world says no, maybe ask yourself why it's not afraid of 40,000 ships, and maybe the answer is that it knows something about doorways that you don't. Go home. Tell them what you saw. It's the only way any of this was worth it. The 13,000 surviving ships of the vast Accord turned, clumsily, painfully, improvising a retreat their doctrine had no words for, and withdrew from the Tamarind line, leaving behind them the wreckage of 27,000 vessels drifting in the throat of the reefs, the largest fleet loss in the recorded history of the galaxy, paid in full to a single old battleship that had never moved from its doorway. But Captain Ed Vance had not come through the battle untouched, and the cost of the day was not paid only by the Flood. The old Reliable was old, and old ships, however well fought, have limits, and the battle had found them. The glancing hit in the 10th minute had done more than spill no coffee. It had cracked a seam in the forward reactor housing that Ed Vance had not mentioned over the channel, because mentioning it would have given the Fleet Speaker hope, and an old soldier does not give the enemy hope. He had fought the last 8 minutes of the battle on a wounded reactor, holding it together with the kind of knowledge that only 40 years aboard one ship can give a man, knowing exactly how much it could take and exactly how much it could not. The point defense barrage that killed the suicide ship had been the last thing the reactor could give. It had given it. And now, with the Flood in retreat and Tamarind safe, the reactor of the old Reliable was failing, and Ed Vance knew that it was failing, and knew too what came next. He turned, slowly, in the chair that had held him through 3 wars, and looked at the 11 hands who had stood the battle with him, and they looked back at him, and there was no need to say the first part of it, because they could all read the reactor board, and there was no one aboard the old Reliable who did not know exactly what a cracked forward housing meant when it had been pushed the way this one had. Listen to me, Ed Vance said, and his voice was as steady as it had been all day, but gentler now, the way a voice goes gentle when the work is done. You've got the small launch, and you've got time to use it, and that's an order, not a discussion. She's going to go, and when she goes, she's going to go big, and I'm not having 11 good people aboard for that. Tamarin's reading us. They've got shuttles up already. You'll be down on a green world drinking something warm inside the hour. He looked at Orla Tan, who had not moved. That means you too, Chief. Captain, Orla Tan said. Somebody's got to hold the reactor steady while the launch clears, or she'll go early and take the launch with her. You know that better than anybody on this ship. I do, Ed Vance said, which is why it's me and not you. I've been holding this reactor together since before you came aboard, Orla. I know her seams like I know my own hands. You'd hold her for 90 seconds. I can hold her for 10 minutes, and 10 minutes is the difference between you getting clear and you not. So you're going to get up, and you're going to take the launch, and you're going to take these 10 people with you, and you're going to let an old man do the one thing he's better at than anybody alive, which is keeping this ship running one more minute than she wants to. His weathered face creased, almost into a smile. Besides, I told the fleet speaker I'd rather be fishing. Can't very well go fishing from a shuttle. There was a silence on the bridge of the Old Reliable, the kind of silence that is its own kind of speech, and then Orla Tan stood and crossed to the old man's chair and put her hand on his shoulder once, briefly, the way you touch a thing you are not going to see again, and said, "Aye, Captain," and gathered the others, and went. And the old man held the reactor steady with his 40 years of knowing it, hand on the manual governor, easing it through the surges it wanted to give way to, while the small launch dropped from the Old Reliable's flank and ran for the green world below, and he did not let the reactor go until the launch was clear, until 11 hands, who had held the door with him, were safe in the gravity well of the world they had saved. Then, and only then, with the ship empty and the door held and nothing left to keep but the keeping of it, Captain Ed Vance opened the colony channel one last time. "Tamarin Control," he said. "This is the Old Reliable. The flood's gone home. You're safe. 90,000 of you safe. My crew's coming down to you in a launch. Treat them well. They earned it. I won't be coming with them. I want you to know that, because I won't be coming in to hear you say thanks." In the colony's listening hall, Brisa Okun pressed her hand flat against the board, as though she could reach through it. "Captain Vance," she said. "Your reactor. We're reading your reactor. Eject. There's still time. You can eject and we'll come get you. We have shuttles. Just eject." "That's kind," Ed Vance said. "But the reactor's going to go, and when it goes, it's going to go big. And I'd rather it go out here, where there's nothing left to hurt but the wreckage I already made, than have it cooking quietly while you tow me in to a world full of people. Old ship like this, you don't bring her home broken. You let her finish. She earned that." A pause. "Besides, I told the fleet speaker I'd rather be fishing, and going to go see if that's true." In the command spire of his retreating flagship, Fleet Speaker Quarrel heard the colony channel, because he had left every human band open, unable to stop listening, and he understood, with a slow, cold horror, entirely unlike the horror of the battle, that the old man who had destroyed 27,000 ships of the vast accord was about to die, alone, on purpose, on the bridge of the ship that had done it, and that he had known he was going to die from the moment he stood it in the throat, and had fished anyway, and had been calm anyway, and had given the fleet speaker one chance to walk away anyway, because his mother had raised him to. Beside him, young Hessel had gone very still, and Quarrel saw that she was weeping, silently, in the way her species wept, and he did not order her to stop, because he found that he could not have stopped himself either. "Tamarin Control," Ed Vance said. "Do me one favor. There's a boy down there, name of Piril, my granddaughter's boy. Half human, half Tamarin born, doesn't matter which, he's mine. Tell him his grandfather went fishing and the fish were biting. He'll know what I mean. We had a joke about it. Tell him the fish were biting and I was happy. That's all. That's everything." "We'll tell him, Captain," Brisa Okun said, and her voice was breaking now. "We'll tell him. Captain, I don't. How do we thank you? 90,000 people. How do we ever?" "You don't," Ed Vance said gently. "You just live. That's the thanks. You live, and you remember that a little world said no to 40,000 ships, and the no held, And you never let anybody tell you that being small means being safe to push around. You hold your doorways. That's how you thank me. Now I've got to go. The reactor's just about done being patient. And so am I. The channel from the old reliable went quiet, and a moment later, far back in the throat of the reefs, among the drifting wreckage of 27,000 ships of the vast accord, the old battleship's failing reactor finally let go, and the old reliable went up in a flash that Fleet Speaker Quarrel saw from the edge of the system, a single bright star flaring and fading in the dark, the death of one old ship and the old man who had refused, gently and absolutely, to let the flood through his door. For a long while after the bright star faded, no one in the command spire spoke. Quarrel sat in the silence of a ship full of people who had just watched a thing none of them had words for, and he found that the silence was the truest sound the accord had made all day, truer than the laughter at the start, truer than the screaming in the middle. The flood had always been loud. It was loud by nature. A thing made of numbers announces itself by its numbers. But the spire was quiet now, the quiet of a civilization that has just heard, for the first time, the size of its own ignorance. And Quarrel understood that he would remember this silence longer than he remembered the battle, because the battle had only taken his ships, and the silence had taken something he had not known he owned, which was the comfortable certainty that he already understood the universe he commanded. Hessel came and stood beside his chair, and for a while she did not speak either, and then she said, very quietly, so that only he could hear it, he let his crew go. Did you mark that, Fleet Speaker? At the end. He had a crew, and he sent them off in a launch, and he stayed to hold the reactor so the launch could clear. I logged the small craft leaving, 11 life signs aboard it, dropping for the surface, while he stayed. She paused. We would not have done that. The Accord. If a ship of ours were dying, we would not have spent a captain to save 11 hands. We would have counted the captain worth more than the 11, and let the 11 go down with the ship. We have always counted that way. Worth is weight. More is more. She looked at the place in the dark where the star had been. He counted the other way. The one for the 11 for the 90,000. He spent the most valuable thing aboard his ship to save the least, all the way down the line, until there was nothing left to spend but himself, and then he spent that too. I do not understand it, Fleet Speaker, but I think it is the thing we lost to, not the reefs. That, the counting that runs the other way. Quarrel did not answer her, because he had no answer, but he carried the words, the way he carried everything from that day, into the long dark of the journey home. Quarrel took the remnant of the vast accord home, and the going home was the strangest journey of his life, because he carried with him a thing the accord had never possessed, and the thing was a lesson. For 11 generations the flood had known only victory, and a thing that knows only victory learns nothing, because there is nothing victory can teach that the victor does not already believe. Quarrel carried home the first defeat in the recorded history of the vast accord, and the defeat was a teacher, and Quarrel had been its only student, the one who had watched it happen, the one who had asked the old human how, the one who had heard the answer. He could have buried it. He could have told the councils that the loss at Tamarind was a freak, an accident, the work of some impossible human weapon, and the councils would have believed him, because the councils, like the flood itself, did not want to learn. But Quarrel had heard the old man's last words on the colony channel, the words about doorways, and the words about a little world that was not afraid, and he found that he could not bury them, because to bury them would be to make the death of the old man mean nothing, and the death of the old man, Quarrel had come to understand, had meant a very great deal. He had help in the not burying of it, and the help was Hessel. The young officer who had read the archives whole had logged the entire battle, the count and the times and the moves and the flaw she had seen flicker in the human ship's reactor band, and when they reached home, she laid the log before Quarrel complete and unflinching, and said, "This is what happened, Fleet Speaker. Not what we wish had happened. If you carry this to the councils as it is, they will hate you for it, and some of them will believe you, and the believing is worth the hating. If you soften it, you will keep your rank and lose the only thing the day was worth." And Quarrel looked at the log, the whole hard honest length of it, and understood that the young officer had given him, twice now, the counsel that floods do not give themselves, and he resolved to be worthy of it once, at the end, having failed to be worthy of it at the start. So he told the councils the truth. He stood before the assembled speakers of the vast accord, the keepers of 11 generations of unbroken conquest, and he told them that the flood had met its doorway, that one old battleship had drowned 27,000 ships in their own momentum, that the lesson of Tamarind was not that humans had a secret weapon, but that the flood had a secret weakness, and that the weakness had been there all along, in the very thing that made the Accord strong. Being too big to stop, he told them, means being too big to stop yourself. And there will always be doorways, and there will always be small worlds that have learned where the doorways are, and the flood that does not learn this will keep meeting old battleships in narrow places until there is no flood left. The councils did not want to hear it. Some of them called Quarrel a coward, a defeatist, a single failed fleet speaker trying to excuse the worst loss in their history by inventing a flaw in the flood itself. But some of them, a few, the wiser ones, the ones who had risen high enough to have begun to wonder, in private, whether unbroken victory was really the same thing as wisdom, listened, and looked at the count of the dead, 27,000 ships, and could not explain it any other way, and began, slowly, to believe. And Hessel stood beside the fleet speaker through all of it, the youngest voice in the chamber, and read aloud from the log when the doubters demanded proof, and the log did not flinch, and neither did she. And the vast accord changed. Not quickly. Floods do not change quickly. But it stopped, after Tamarind, sending 40,000 ships to drown small worlds that said no. It began, haltingly, to ask why a world might say no, and to consider that the answer might be worth knowing. It began to study doorways, and to understand the places where its numbers turned to weight, and in the studying, it became, against everything in its long history, a little wiser, which is to say, a little less of a flood, and a little more of a civilization. The change saved more lives than Quarrel could ever count. The lives of all the small worlds the flood did not drown, because it had finally learned that some doorways cost more than they were worth. And in time, generations later, when the vast accord had become a thing that negotiated where it had once drowned, the historians of the accord wrote that the change had begun on a single day, at a single line, when 40,000 ships crossed a border to burn one colony and met one old battleship standing in a doorway, and lost, and learned. They did not have the old captain's name at first. It had not seemed important to record the name of an enemy, but Fleet Speaker Quarrel, in the last years of his life, made sure it was added to the record, because he had carried it home along with the lesson, and had never once forgotten it, the plain, tired, affectionate name of the ship, and the plain, tired, calm voice of the man. And he wanted the Accord to remember that its great turning had been bought by one old human who would rather have been fishing, and who had died alone on the bridge of his ship so that 90,000 strangers could live, and who had given the flood, at the very end, the one thing 11 generations of victory never had, a reason to become something better. On Tamarind, the 90,000 lived. The 11 hands of the old reliable came down in their small launch to a world that did not know how to hold them. And Tamarind learned, fast, and held them anyway. And Orlatan stayed, in the end, and taught the farming world the few hard things it needed to know about doorways, so that the no would have hands behind it the next time, if there ever was a next time. The colony named the throat of the reefs the Old Reliable's Gate, and they left the wreckage of the 27,000 drifting there, untouched. A monument and a warning, the largest graveyard of ships in the galaxy, kept exactly as it fell so that anyone who ever again thought to send a flood through that doorway would see, first, what the last flood had become. And the boy named Piril was told, by Brisa Okun herself, who walked out to the family's orchard with the message she had promised to carry, and knelt down in the grass to give it to him at his own height. She told him his grandfather had gone fishing, and that the fish were biting, and that he had been happy. And the boy, who was small, and who did not yet understand the size of what had happened in the sky, understood the joke, because it had been his joke too, and he nodded, solemnly, and said that the fish were always biting when Grandpa went, and Brisa Okun said yes, that was right, they always were, and she did not let the boy see her face until she had it under control again. Pearl grew into a man, and then an old man himself, and every year, on the day of the battle, the colony was quiet, and the people gathered, and the old man who had once been the boy told the children the story of his grandfather, who went fishing on the day 40,000 ships came, and held the door, and did not come home, and was happy, because the fish were biting, and the no held, and a little world that had been told it was too small to matter, had said no to the largest fleet in the history of the galaxy, and the no had held, and would go on holding, because an old man in a doorway had shown them how. Far out beyond the Tamarind Line, the vast accord ran quiet now through the dark it had once drowned, smaller in its ambitions and larger in its understanding, and it remembered, the way the chastened remember, the day it learned the difference between being unstoppable and being unbeatable, and the name of the one old ship that had taught it, standing alone in a doorway, between 40,000 and 90,000, and choosing, with its last breath, the 90,000. The fish were biting, the no held, and the old battleship, in the end, was exactly as reliable as its name,